Hello and welcome to Scholarly Bibliographies. This PowerPoint presentation is prepared for ORGL 398, Research Foundations for Understanding. I'm Megan O'Neill. An annotated bibliography can be a little confusing to put together. Essentially, it is a trail of all the research that you've done. The one that you're working on now will provide the research that allows you to reflect on your experiences, to revise the first essay that you wrote, and to provide you with research kind of multidisciplinary context with which to proceed to the final paper. So let's take a look at the assignment specifically. Research into the various disciplinary and academic lenses that are relevant and applicable to your own experience and goals will allow you to examine that experience, reflect on it in multiple ways, and provide you with context from which to proceed with the final paper. Compiling this list of at least 8 resources will provide you with a range and depth of theoretical and disciplinary perspectives to use to ground your final paper. The sources in the bibliography should represent a variety of academic and professional disciplines. Each entry in the bibliography will be accompanied by an annotation, a brief paragraph of information about the source. Each annotation should include 3 parts: a brief summary of the main ideas, a brief discussion of how the ideas are significant to you, and a brief description of how you can expect to use the source in your final paper. Use APA format. You'll note that I've highlighted the key terms here. I want you to use this assignment to examine, reflect, and provide context for the work that you did in the very first Learning from Experience paper. As you reflect on that material, you'll be able to layer it, support it, expand it, develop it, and challenge it with the research from various disciplines and professional perspectives. Doing the research first will allow you to rethink your Learning from Experience concept and see it in a multiple way. I've also asked you to include an annotation. We'll talk more about how to write an annotation in just a moment. It's important to understand why I'm asking you to put together a scholarly annotated bibliography. They're useful in a number of ways. For one thing, students are notorious, and professionals are notorious, for doing the research and writing about it all at the same time. Instead, you can get a much better result, much deeper learning, and a more synthesized example of your materials if you do these research and writing steps separately. So I ask you to do the research first so that you can understand what's out there before you begin to write about it and incorporate it into your own ideas. Aside from that specific usefulness, scholarly bibliographies demonstrate a number of purposes. For one, they review and represent the available research on a topic. They may go back 10 years, they may only cover 5 years, they may ask you to go back to the beginning of recorded history. But in any case, no matter what the topic is, there will have already been a conversation happening about it in the literature. It's on to you to find that literature and to review it in order that you understand the concepts and the conversation that you're entering into. Bibliographies also demonstrate your ability to identify and to evaluate source material. Not just that it's relevant, that's only just identifying useful material. Evaluating it is something completely different, and it must happen in order for your work to be credible and effective. Evaluating source material can be as simple as, is this written by a peer-reviewed source? Is this provided relatively recently? Does this seem to be a credible website? There are many ways to evaluate source material. The OWL at Purdue will provide you with some additional information, as will our library research information. Notice, too, that a scholarly bibliography provides you a handy reference. As you continue writing the project, it's normal for some of your reference sources to change and shift or become less or more relevant as you write. Writing is a living document and a living process. When you need to go back to a source that you've included in your annotated bibliography, you'll notice that most annotated bibliographies include a bibliography of bibliographies. I'm not going to ask you to do that, but be aware that you can always go back to a source that you have already looked at in order to see from a new perspective whether it would be useful. Finally, a scholarly bibliography allows you to synthesize a number of sources ahead of writing any writing tasks you may have about them. You can think about annotated bibliographies in a number of ways. You might conceive them as a map of the available research in an area, so that as you're walking down the trail of your idea, you're picking various thoughts as they come up along the pathway. You might also want to think about this as a constellation in the sky around a central point, for example, the North Pole, or perhaps the North Star, and then a number of star systems that are corralled around it, sort of like a kaleidoscope, but thinking about this as around a central idea, a range or a network of other people's thoughts. In a more mundane way, we can think about a scholarly annotated bibliography as a record of the research process. Aside from metaphor, however, really an annotated bibliography is a simple works cited list with targeted summaries of each item on the list. Here we have a sample of a typical entry in an annotated bibliography. You begin with the actual source information, citing it in APA style. That's the entry on the list. The annotation is the paragraph that follows, and it should offer a brief summary of the material. Yes, this is considered brief. Let's review. This article reviews differing English for specific purposes, ESP, trends in practice and in theory. Belcher, the author, categorizes the trends into three non-exclusive sects: socio-discoursal, socio-cultural, and socio-political. Belcher acknowledges the preconceived shortcomings of ESP in general, including its emphasis on narrowly defined venues, page 165, its tendency to, quote, help learners fit into rather than contest existing structures, page 166, and its supposed cookie-cutter approach. In response to these common apprehensions about ESP, Belcher cites the New Rhetoric movement and the Sydney School as two institutions that have influenced progressive changes and given more depth to genre. Ultimately, she agrees with Swales, 1996, that most genres could help ESL learners are hidden or poorly taught, and the field of genre is only beginning to grasp the multitude of complexities within this potentially valuable approach to the instruction of language, and in turn, writing. Yes, that is a brief annotation. Note that it performs several different tasks. By its choice of words, it indicates the kind of source. It's an article. By its use of appropriate verbs, we understand the point of the author. The author is categorizing three specific trends in practice and in theory. It quotes where appropriate and gives credit to the author in that way. Narrowly defined venues, for example, the tendency to, quote, help learners fit into, and so forth. It's important to use brief quotations and to ensure that your summary, your annotation, is more summary than anything else. Note also that at the very end, where she agrees with, quote, where, quote, she agrees with Swales, unquote, this gives you the opportunity to put a source in context with the conversation in which it has been taking place. From that example annotation, we can then see the basics. Identify the kind of source, identify its primary argument. You don't need a lot of explanatory detail, but you need minimal and sufficient explanatory detail. Use appropriate verbs to describe the work. Is your source categorizing, describing, or postulating? Briefly quote where appropriate, with the page citation, to indicate key terms and concepts. Finally, end, if you can, with some indication of where this source is positioned in the field. In the previous example, it was she agrees with X's research indicating. That was a typical example of an annotation. For this particular course, I would like you to do one thing in addition to that typical annotation. Please include a sentence or two about how you think you might use the source. For example, the previous annotation had this as a follow-up. This article provides examples as well as expert opinion that I can use in my project. This will provide me with evidence to support my claims about the current disciplines in ESL studies. To give yourself this kind of idea about how you may or may not use a specific source will give you a hint about where you intended to go when you come back to the source to begin with. If you didn't already know, what you need to expect is that research takes time. You have to allow yourself plenty of time to do the work. This is time that's invested well, and if you do it well, it'll pay good dividends in the quality of the research that you include in your final essay. I would recommend that you keep accurate records of where you've searched and what you've found. At the very least, you should keep track of the essential information you'll need to find a source again: the author's full name, the title of the publication, the date of the publication, and what kind of publication. Is it a book, an article, a scholarly website, a professional journal, and so forth? It will be useful also to keep track of why it seemed like a good source. Microsoft Word and a number of word processing programs have an element built into what the toolbar called References is. You may want to explore this so that you can keep track of your research records. Finally, please remember that the bibliography you submit for this course should be the best of the research you've found, not just the first 8 to 10 sources that seemed like they would work. Ideally, I would recommend that you find about 20 sources that are relevant, and then you cull through them, comb through them, evaluate them, reconsider them, use them as interchangeable pieces as you begin to compose your essay, and then you'll decide what of the sources are the best.